to kick off our final session today, we have a very own Dennis Buchheim from IAB Tech Lab, Harold Keller from AdID, and Rachel Nyswander Thomas from TAG. So they'll talk about some key identifiers in our complicated ad ecosystem. You've heard a lot about identifiers. So this session is about demystifying identifiers. So Dennis.
Hopefully we will actually succeed in demystifying here. So thanks for having us back. So changing topics, but something that's come up quite a few times, I think, today is what are the different types of identifiers? And we've mostly heard about we've heard about asset IDs today. We've heard a little bit about consumer identifiers. Thank you. And one thing we haven't heard as much about, I would say, is what we would call a business identifier. So this is something that we put together probably less than a year ago in any case, but really trying to just as simply as we could describe the different types of identifiers that exist. And this doesn't even get into transaction IDs, which were mentioned earlier, but at least kind of these core, this trio of identifiers that are really needed to work together and that enable fighting fraud, that enable supporting brand safety, privacy, a better user experience, measurement, attribution. They're kind of the basis for everything. And we started with, well, first you need to know, what is the asset that you're actually tagging, right? So that you can understand that this is the ad that is moving through the supply chain. And that's ad ID, for example. And then there on the content side, IDER is an example. Then it's a matter of, okay, who is that asset actually being shared with, right? Who is it passing through? Who's working with that asset on its final path to the consumer? And that's a business identifier, and that is one business identifier, a pretty prominent one is Tag ID, and we'll hear more about that. We also think about identifying who you are in the context of ads.txt, for example, and who you work with, and you can also conveniently use Tag ID to be that identifier, so those two can go hand in hand. And then finally, hopefully, you get to the consumer, right? And how do you actually identify who you're working with and enable measurement, enable targeting, enable all the things we like to do. There are IFAs, obviously, and I'll talk to you a little bit about Digitrust also as another alternative. But that's the last piece, is the consumer identifier. And we kind of put this together. It seems awfully simple, but we put this together because we started getting questions literally like, my clients say they're using Tag ID. Should they also be doing Digitrust? And that's sort of like apples and oranges, right? They're both fruit, right? They go together in a way, but they're different things, right? And so it's a really important thing to kind of understand the different types of IDs that are out there. So on the consumer side, and thinking about Digitrust specifically in our case, Digitrust, which Tech Lab acquired this April, it actually started out of an IAB working group several years ago. Tech Lab did not exist as an organization at that point. It wound up getting spun out, and as Tech Lab has matured as an organization, we saw an opportunity to bring it to Tech Lab as an interesting asset and resource for members and for the industry as a whole. So the impetus for starting Digitrust was all of these different cookie syncs that happen, and with each sync that happens from from a publisher and a DMP over to an SSP over to a DSP, and ultimately in terms of what an agency or advertiser is actually able to target, able to measure, you see these constant drop-offs, and you see this horrible inefficiency of all of this code on page in browsers to execute these syncs. And it's a huge percentage of the code on page and creates massive delays in page load time. And so that was the motivation, is okay, we have to be able to do better than 27% by the time the ID goes through the chain of syncing. We have to be able to do better than 27% in enabling the syncing, and we have to be able to do better for the actual consumers at the end of it, and we have to be able to tie it to consumer preferences for privacy and really create a better experience for all parties involved. So as we looked at that, that's been evolving over the past few years, and now we have additional challenges that we're really working through in our DigiTrust ID working group at Tech Lab. But we highlight the regulation, of course, so GDPR, but California privacy, U.S. federal privacy potentially. That makes things more complicated, right? To make this all work together, and it also creates an increased need for a solution like this, so that we can comply consistently with privacy preferences that consumers have. Browsers, most notably Safari, but Mozilla to an extent as well, have started to pull back on on what they allow for tracking cookies, as you probably know. So our ID working group is thinking even beyond the cookie and thinking of how we work with browsers and how do we actually address this collectively as an industry and effectively create an IFA for the web. And that's kind of the notion. So the quick version of DigiTrust is that currently it is cookie based. But it's kind of a framework for how we work together to create this persistent ID that enables 100% audience recognition or very close to it, that dramatically reduces the third-party syncs, the third-party requests, creates a better consumer experience as a result, that is highly compliant with privacy regulation and hopefully gets ahead of the privacy regulations where appropriate, that is governed on a neutral basis through Tech Lab and our members. And that is it's a really simple model. I tend to describe it as kind of the hub and spoke model. So instead of each of these different third parties syncing directly with each other, they subscribe to DigiTrust, and DigiTrust enables encrypting and decrypting IDs, and that's the very simple version of the model of DigiTrust. But it's a foundational capability. It's something that works with other ID solutions in market. And most notably, we've actually been working with the Advertising ID Consortium that was started by LiveRamp and others, and employing the option, at least, to subscribe to DigiTrust and the ID Consortium and use the two together. So we're definitely looking at it as a kind of connector capability, DigiTrust across different ID platforms. And with that, I will hand it to, that's just some of the members we have, but if you're interested in DigiTrust, actually, Jordan, where did Jordan go? There he is. Jordan Mitchell, please see him if you're interested in subscribing to DigiTrust. And I'll hand to Rachel for Tag ID.
Is this working? Excellent. Hey, everybody. Thank you. So is anybody not familiar with Tag? You just made my day. I've been here since our inception. This room used to look very different in its response, so this is a really good starting point. So Tag ID, who has a Tag ID? Who's aware of having a Tag ID? Okay, so you probably all have Tag IDs at your companies. So let's talk about what that actually means for you. So, in order to become part of Tag, you have to be a known company, right? We do a background check on all of the companies before you can be a part of the community. Involves financials and all sorts of fun things. And when you have proven that you are a known entity in this industry, then you are valid to receive your Tag ID, be a part of this community, and use that to communicate who you are and what your tag status is as an organization. It is really important in terms of more and more folks requiring that you have not only a Tag ID, but you have a particular status with Tag, certification, et cetera. The Tag ID is what makes it easy to communicate what your status is with regard to meeting important standards that are set within the industry by Tag with all of you. Tag ID has been built into all sorts of different existing specs in the environment at this point. Not only can you go to the Tag website and look it up or go through the Tag API and see it in the registry, but you will see Tag IDs carried through OpenRTB. You will see them carried in ads.txt files more and more. And of course, they're a very important basis for identification in Tag's payment ID system, which is really how we create a trusted chain of custody for transactions and lower fraud in those rates. So really, again, people are very aware that Tag works on fraud. We also work on piracy and malware, and equally important, we work on increasing transparency across the supply chain such that those kinds of criminal activities are much harder to perpetrate. And by virtue of companies having those Tag IDs to look for, it really does make it more difficult then to transact as an illegitimate partner, shall we say, in the supply chain. All right, so the most basic way you can find out about a company is to go to our website, right? type in Google or Google's tag ID if they've shared that with you, or whatever the company might be, and you can see, again, they're part of the community, so we know who they are. It's the real Google. It's the real publisher, not somebody spoofing a publisher or a brand. It's the real company, and here's what they have done in terms of proving themselves as a trusted partner in the supply chain, whether it's certification around fraud, piracy, malware, inventory quality. You can find out where those certs are applicable in their geographic footprint around the world, when those expire, all sorts of information that buyers and sellers both need in choosing the right partners to work with, such that they know that they are not making either kind of brand, a buyer or a sell-side brand, open to that kind of criminal association. We believe in doing things that actually work at TAG, and so we do a lot of research, a lot of checking best practices to make sure that we're getting somewhere. We recently, just in the last few weeks, actually put out our second annual fraud benchmark study in the US, which found once again that when you choose to buy through TAG certified channels, when companies do the work to know who those partners are and to choose only to work with those that have met certain high standards, your fraud rates drop by 84% over industry average, right? 1.68% is a pretty good rate, given that we at TAG recognize there's always going to be fraudsters out there. Let's get it as low as we possibly can and then focus on preventing that last little bit. So that, again, just for anyone that didn't see the research, it covered something like 75 billion impressions across 6 different major ad agency holding companies. We expanded this year to include video and mobile in-app, et cetera. And nonetheless, from year on year, those fraud rates are staying incredibly low, under 2%. So it's working. All the more reason that we want companies to be aware of how to use your tag ID. To Dennis's point, we get some very interesting questions about, all right, you gave me this thing, now what? Which is a totally fair question. The most common question we get is this relevant to me? Tag, not everybody in the supply chain works with everybody. TAG works with every kind of company working in digital advertising, and there is a role for you in using your tag ID no matter where you sit in that entire supply chain. So these are just some of the examples in terms of knowing your partners, indicating to your partners the level of trust that they can have with you given the standards that you've met, identifying your own assets, whether it's putting your tag ID with your creative or with your inventory through ads.txt to identify that it really is, you that that owns these assets and not a criminal. And again, leaving that trail of breadcrumbs so that you can be understood as being part of a trusted chain of custody as things move along. There we go.
Thank you. So I like to start my conversation with a very important quote, and it's sort of fundamentally, you have to ask yourself the question: if you can't identify something, you can't operationalize or measure it, and if you can't measure it, you kind of can't monetize it. And when we talk about a lot of the problems that we've heard about today, frequency capping and quality of ads and so on, these are sort of the symptoms of the problem where we don't identify the creative. Therefore, we see the same ad running back to back to back to back, or we see the same category being used multiple times. So I always like to start with my friend Clyde Smith and this quote. Ad ID is the UPC code for advertising. We're a joint venture of the 4As and the ANA. We also, we tend to serve somewhere around 350,000 ads a year. Ad ID is celebrating our 15th anniversary this year, and we've served over 3 million ads since we were created. We've got over 4,000 advertisers that have used the platform. The other thing that people don't necessarily know is that Ad ID provides free codes to 501c3 charities. So we do our best to not be a burden to large, small, or charities. And we also have an open standard API called Complete External Access. So for a valued publisher or vendor or supply chain partner, this Complete External Access API allows for the retrieval of all of the metadata that's stored in Ad ID. And the idea is that the API is made available free of charge so that you can then justify to your advertisers who aren't necessarily using ad ID that, hey, this metadata is valuable, this unique ID is valuable, and it really tends to work well. So we've heard a lot about the universal ad ID element in VAST 4.1. It is a required element, and we've shown you some examples here. Now, ad ID is not the only identifier that's actually used in VAST 4.1. In the UK, there is the Clearcast ID. In the future, there'll be other IDs in other countries, so there's talk of including the French identifier as well. But the idea is we have a model here where we register, operationalize, and have the ability to measure and report based on that ID. And we also talked earlier about the fact that the ID is embedded inside of the physical asset. Again, you've got this intersection of both the asset and the instructions, which give you a pretty powerful combination to be able to do innovative things. One of the challenges, and we've heard this over and over again today, the idea that the same ad is getting multiple different proprietary IDs, getting it through a publisher, through an ad server, through an ad network, and programmatic platforms. Everybody's assigning what they see as unique IDs inside of their platforms, and it doesn't do wonders for the consumer's experience. So that's ad ID and what we do.
One thing, I saw a couple of, thank you, a couple of raised eyebrows when you were talking about 3 million ads, by the way. So that I think to clarify, right, that's not 3 million ads served to consumers, that's 3 million creatives that had ad IDs associated.
Correct.
And it's mostly video creatives, so that's a whole lot of video ads, right?
Right, and in terms of the in terms of the television ecosystem, so you just talk about network and cable, we're probably somewhere between 70 and 80% of the television ecosystem. So as we start seeing some of that inventory reused across platforms, the idea is to encourage the use of the ad ID that came with that ad. And if there have been changes or versioning that's been done, it needs a new ad ID. And that's part of the workflow that the agencies are familiar with. When they're doing versioning workflows, when they're doing revision workflows, they're used to assigning a new ID to the ad. And so it's taking some of that process and bringing it over into the digital ecosystem.
Thanks. So here I kind of tweaked the diagram I shared earlier of some of Tech Lab's standards, removed a handful just to make it simpler to look at, but added in, as you can see, where tag, ad ID, Digitrust either currently play a role and can be deployed or could be deployed in the future. So that just gives you a sense of, across, sort of back to, in some ways, that demystifying identifiers, going from the asset from the asset over to the consumer, what is that path, and where are the different IDs, where do they initiate and where are they actually carried through? So with that, we have a few minutes left. I would love to open it to questions if there are questions or any comments on how you're using IDs today and any challenges you have potentially.
I think people just want pictures of your slide, actually, Dennis.
Got a question over there and a question over there.
May I get the mic to you?
Hi, I missed the first part of the presentation, so apologies if this was addressed earlier, but I was wondering what the process is for becoming like a registry for an ad ID, and how I guess having multiple registries for a universal ad ID is different from having multiple parties that each have their own unique identifier for that ad, right? Because you still have, you're still not having a centralized registry for everything.
Great question, thank you. So firstly, to be a registrant with ad ID, it's basically most of our customers are advertisers and agencies. So if you are producing an ad, you would just come in, register, and get a licensed prefix, which is like the first 4 characters that identify the advertiser, and then you would just register the ads. And generally, that is the trusted party who is either the production company or the agency or the advertiser. To your question about multiple registries, when we wrote the universal ad ID element into VAST 4.1, we were very clear to say that there will be multiple registries or multiple registration authorities, but on a regional basis. So Ads produced in the US get ad IDs. Ads produced in the UK get Clearcast IDs. That really relates to some of the, whether it's process-related issues or whether it's standards and practices clearance issues. We have not been able to figure out the way to have a single global registry for ads, because every region, every country has different requirements. But we've been very clear in the way that VAST 401 is written and the Universal Ad ID is written in there that it's single regional registration authorities.
And not that you asked about the consumer side, but the quick answer on the consumer side. So with DigiTrust, for example, is DigiTrust is not the only ID offering out there, obviously. But the question is how we can actually help with DigiTrust to connect different different IDs, like the Advertising ID Consortium ID. Net ID in Germany, right? There are a number, they're a small number, but a number of consumer ID consortia and other entities out there, and we see a way actually for DigiTrust to be a connector across them.
Hi, two questions. One is the ad ID is not required in VAST 4.1. Is that a fair statement?
Well, the universal ad ID element is required. There is an option to say there is none.
Right.
However, as we want to see this move further out through the ecosystem, we want to see that more populated more and more.
And why do you think this been so slow to adopt? The industry has been so slow to adopt ad ID since linear's been doing it for like 50 years. Like every creative has an ISKI code or ad ID, and all the broadcasters use the same one.
I believe that part of the challenge is that the digital ecosystem is evolving and growing up, and some of the discipline and some of the process that sort of has been ingrained inside of the linear ecosystem is starting to find its way over. Cross-platform measurement and operations are becoming a big deal. So I wouldn't say that it's been slow. VAST 4.1 is the first time that there is an element in the VAST tag for that ID. And I think it came out of the fact that this need for cross-platform is becoming that much more important.
And even cross-format, right? So not just video, but display and other formats too.
But I think it's also fair to say that we're at a particular moment in this industry in terms of transparency. I mean, to your point, right? Things are different today than they were 5 years or 10 years or 15 years ago, right? In all sorts of ways, but particularly in terms of the need for that trust, right? The need to understand exactly who you're working with. So I think, I don't think that the past has to be in any way representative of where we're headed, right? We hear every day from our clients, the 400, 500 companies that are involved in TAG, we want to understand better exactly what's going on in transactions. So I think the moment is right for this kind of a conversation, and we look forward to helping you guys, move the industry further and further down that road at a faster and faster pace, to your point.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to close. I think that's true across all of the different types of IDs here, right? That there is a much greater willingness to work together now, I think in general, across the industry than there ever has been, and build that trust. And these are some tools that help enable that. So with that, we will get off the stage before we get the hook. So thank you very much.